When you think of the poppy seed, what comes to mind? Because for most people, it's probably opium and heroin, or perhaps even the synthetic offshoot, fentanyl. But did you know that we actually have a 7,000 year history with poppies? And it might not look like you think it looks. So how is it that something that was usually eaten as food, and then which turned into a medicine, slowly became corrupted, used as a weapon to destroy entire countries and populations? Well, that's exactly what we're going to get into. So stick around and buckle up, because this is quite an eye-opening story. Today, we're going to examine humanity's relationship with the poppy seed, a 7,000 year history. This is how you corrupt a flower. Around 5600 BCE, there were many farming communities across the Western Mediterranean regularly eating poppy seeds. They would press them for oil or toss them into bread. Radiocarbon dating marks them as far back as 5622 BCE. The question is when it stops being food and turns into something else. Around 1300 BCE, in a small shrine on Crete, an ancient Minoan craftsman produced a terracotta figure roughly the height of a child. She has her arms raised and her palms open. The peculiar thing is that her head is crowned with 3 movable hairpin-like capsules, which are shaped like the poppy seed pod, each with vertical incisions as well, which is the exact cut used to harvest opium. And just when you thought that the Bronze Age collapse meant the Sea Peoples had truly destroyed everything in the Eastern Mediterranean, we learned that opium survived. By the time the Greeks had built their classical civilization, it was practically everywhere, from the practice of their spirituality to medicine as well. Hippocrates, who you may recognize from the Hippocratic Oath, actually prescribed it to people. Theophrastus documented how to extract opium from the poppy seed. And even Homer in the Odyssey talked about Helen of Troy dropping a little mixture into the wine of grieving men, which would make them erase their sorrows. And while there is a widespread debate about what that tincture actually was, the leading candidate is opium. In the 2nd century CE, Rome's most famous doctor, a man named Galen, built his reputation on a compound called theriac, a cure-all containing dozens of ingredients, but opium was at its core, and he actually gave it daily to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, a so-called Stoic, believed to be completely addicted. And yet so was everyone else. In fact, Galen's theriac formula, with opium at its core, was a standard in Western medicine until the 1700s. So when you really look at it, poppy seeds were beginning to be recognized for what they were, but their potency hadn't been fully realized. So we know it was in Greece, we know it was used in Rome, and we know it has this reputation. But for around 400 to 500 years, poppy seeds didn't really spread around much. It was more of a localized recreational drug. But something happened which led it to expand from just the Mediterranean, and that was the Silk Road. So in the 7th and 8th centuries, Arab and Persian merchants began facilitating the most long-distance trade networks that the world had ever seen. And what that meant is that you would have merchants traveling through Central Asia, in ships across the Indian Ocean, and they would carry medicinal kits in case people got hurt or injured, and in those kits, they had poppy seeds. So this is what allowed poppy to spread to India, to China, and to other areas of Central and Eastern Asia. It was well known in the Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an, around 700 CE, which was a city of around 1 million people, larger than any city in Europe at the time. Poppies arrived in this world as a medicine, and opium was just one of the many drugs entering Chinese pharmacopoeias. And yet still, opium wasn't necessarily seen as something dangerous. That was until a Middle Eastern man sat down to write a book that changed how the whole world understood medicine. In the West, they call him Avicenna. Born in 980 CE near Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan, he became one of the world's most prolific scientific and philosophical writers. In 1025 CE, he completed his masterpiece, the Canon of Medicine. And in it, Avicenna described poppy as a powerful medicine, not just something for recreational use, but with even potentially poisonous qualities. And he also described specific methods of delivery and dosing. He warned doctors not to use it unless absolutely necessary. In fact, Avicenna was the first to caution about its use. And yet, his clarity didn't stop opium from spreading. Every physician trained in the Islamic world read his books and learned about opium's uses. And then, after his canon was translated into Latin in the 12th century, every physician in Europe learned about it too. So Avicenna had essentially turned this folk drug into an institutionalized one with documented case usage. And then it met the New World. Everything changed in 1492. Columbus makes his famous voyage, sails to the Americas, and in the Caribbean, he encounters people smoking tobacco. So obviously, he brings that back to Europe, but unknowingly, he just changed the history of opium forever, as he also brought back the technology of smoking tobacco. Now, previously, opium had never been smoked before. It had usually been turned into a tea, or like Helen, administered as drops into other drinks. But now, for the first time, you could smoke it, which absolutely changed everything. It made it much easier to consume, and the high was so much more intense that it made it far more addictive. And remember, we already had people who said that they could go just a few hours without doing it. We already had cases of addiction, so imagine how much this changed everything. And change everything it did. The technology spread from Lisbon to the Arabian Peninsula, to the Indian subcontinent, to China, to all of Southeast Asia. Dutch traders in 17th century present-day Java noted that locals would actually create this mixture of herbs and opium, which they called madak, and they would smoke it as a supposed treatment for malaria. And Dutch traders actually noted they could make a profit selling it, and it was something that they spread from island to island. In present-day Philippines, they spread it to present-day Taiwan. And so it's really with the advent of the technology of smoking that we see the prevalence of opium spread all throughout and across the old world, facilitated, of course, through Silk Road trade networks. So this is really the turning point. For 7,000 years, opium had been eaten, it had been drunk, and these led to a very slow absorption. Smoking changed all of that. The drug reached the brain faster, the rush was much sharper, and the addiction ran deeper. So madak turned out to be far more addictive than the opium of the past, even if it was just intended as a treatment for malaria in Southeastern Asia. And this is exactly why the Portuguese would start moving it across borders. Vasco da Gama rounded Africa in 1498, and within a decade, the Portuguese had seized Goa on India's west coast, then Malacca in present-day Malaysia, and then they leased a trading post from the Chinese at Macau in 1557. So from these commercial centers, the Portuguese engaged not only in intercontinental trade, but also in regional trade, including the transport of opium from India to China at a considerable profit. This is really the overlooked history. Everybody thinks of the British right away, but most histories skip over the Portuguese. Even though the Portuguese had been running Indian opium into China for over a century before the British East India Company got there. Through Macau, technically Chinese territory, but practically a lawless smuggling hub, traders like the Goan merchant Rogerio de Faria built fortunes moving Malwa opium up the Pearl River Delta, while China's customs officials looked the other way, or were paid to. So the route was complete. We had Indian poppy fields, we had Portuguese ships, and Chinese smokers. So the whole network was laid out. But while the British didn't build this route, they definitely inherited it and industrialized it, because by 1773, Britain had something that the Portuguese didn't have. They had conquered the Indian subcontinent, so that meant a monopoly on its most productive poppy fields. And they also had a governor-general named Warren Hastings. So the flower that started as a food in Neolithic Europe had now crossed 3 continents, been encoded in the world's most authoritative medical textbook, infused with smoking technology from the Americas, and now was being delivered to China, the most populous nation on Earth. All that was left was for England to turn it into a weapon. Yet again, someone had beat England to it. Several someones, actually. The utilization and weaponization of poppies and opium was a practice that they inherited, just like many colonial systems inherit from the empires that came before them. So when you start and when you notice opium weaponization, particularly in India, for example, you have to start with the Indians. And when you start with the Indians, you start with the Mughals. So from the mid-16th century onward, the Mughal Empire ran opium as a state monopoly. At its height, controlling most of the Indian subcontinent, perhaps 150 million people, roughly a quarter of the world's population and a quarter of global GDP. It was actually the richest empire on Earth. Under Emperor Akbar, who ruled from 1556 to 1605, nearly 50 years, who was generally considered the greatest Mughal ruler, poppy land was actually cataloged and taxed alongside grain yields, things like elephant herds, and military rosters. For Emperor Akbar, opium served multiple functions. It generated revenue and provided a medical supply. Opium pellets were taken orally, given to field workers to keep up their strength and stamina. So it kept people productive, but it also kept them dependent. And that line between medicine and control has always been thin, and the Mughals knew exactly where it was. Then there were the elephants. Opium war elephants. Yes, Mughal war elephants were given intoxicants like opium to enrage them and lose their sense of judgment. Mughal war elephants were actually the first documented military application of opiates. The Mughal court also demonstrated rather vividly what happens when a drug economy reaches its absolute apex. Because it wasn't just elephants, it was actually also emperors. 17th century Emperor Jahangir became so subdued by opium and alcohol that his wife, the foreign-born Queen Nur Jahan, Light of the World, ran his empire during most of his reign. Nur Jahan signed imperial decrees, commanded armies. She even issued coinage in her own name. She was functionally the ruler of the wealthiest empire on earth, qualified by her own formidable intelligence, but also partly by the fact that her husband was an incapacitated opium drug addict. And to the west, the Ottoman Empire also had a relationship with opium. It was a bit older, more embedded, and arguably more honest, really, about what it was. Anatolia, now modern-day Turkey, had actually woven poppies into everyday life at every social level, from the coffee houses of Constantinople, where it was eaten in a paste form, to the imperial military. The Janissaries, who were the elite Ottoman infantry, the finest soldiers in Europe, were actually known and recognized to be poppy enthusiasts. Some historians argue poppies were part of their preparation for battle. In 1573, a Venetian diplomat stationed at the Ottoman court wrote home describing Turks who drank a black tea made with poppies, to which they became so habituated that going without it could kill them. And even though this doesn't showcase usage of the smoking technology, instead they were drinking it by tea, it is notable that they were still getting addicted to it. And this is actually one of the earliest clinical descriptions of a poppy craze in the historical record. So the Venetian wasn't just alarmed by the poppies itself, he was alarmed by the dependency. The distinction between using a drug and being addicted to it was starting to take effect. What was once a flower, grown so its seeds could be eaten, then had a slight warning cast over it by Avicenna, was now slowly showing its darker colors in both the European trade routes, but also in the Ottoman and Mughal empires. And that brings us back to Warren Hastings. He arrives in Bengal in 1772 as the East India Company's governor, inheriting established poppy fields in Bihar and Benares, and a merchant syndicate in Patna. Then, in 1773, Hastings does something neither the Mughals nor the Ottomans had quite managed. He turned a pre-existing opium economy into a weapon of foreign policy. Opium is not a necessary of life, Hastings said, but a pernicious article of luxury, which ought not to be permitted except for purposes of foreign commerce only. Think about what he's saying. Warren Hastings had basically laid the groundwork for the weaponization of opium. He said, it's too dangerous and it's too risky for us to sell it to our own people, but I don't have a problem if we produce it and sell it to others. So let's take a look at the Patna opium factory. Every chest contains 40 balls. Every ball weighs 6 pounds. Each ball is rolled by hand from a paste of opium and water, then wrapped in dried poppy petals, stacked on shelves to dry, and then inspected before packaging and distribution. At the British factory in Patna, 600 kilometers up the Ganges from Calcutta, Indian laborers worked day and night, required to produce at least 100 balls per day. In high season, the factory ran 16 to 20,000 balls daily, in temperatures reaching 40 degrees Celsius. So opium smuggling to China naturally increased from around 200 chests in 1729 to more than 40,000, 2,160 tons in 1832. But the British East India Company had a problem. It was producing more and more and more opium, and it wasn't selling it to its own people, and it didn't want to, but it was illegal in China. Qing emperors had banned it since 1729, and so they had to find a workaround. They didn't want to sell it directly, or else they could be held liable, and they would risk their trading relationship, which would of course compromise the tea and silk that they were saying they were selling back in London, and which they actually were making quite a lot of money from. And so, like any sophisticated smuggler, what they did was they had to get creative, and they employed middlemen to do the selling for them. It auctioned the opium in Calcutta to private merchants who then sold that opium to smugglers along the Chinese coast. The gold and silver received from those sales were turned over to the British East India Company, which used the proceeds to purchase goods for the British market. So everything looked clean. They could say they were making their money from tea and silk. The company never had to touch the drug past its production in Calcutta. The firm that dominated this whole arrangement was Jardine, Matheson and Company. Its founders were William Jardine, a surgeon familiar with the opium trade, and he partnered with someone named James Matheson, who was fluent in Chinese commercial culture and had spent years building networks in Canton. Together, they built the most powerful distribution network that reached deep into China's interior. They had 19 ships, hundreds of smaller vessels, and they made opium selling a professional business. They were definitely drug dealers, but they were bordering on becoming drug lords. Then, in 1838, the Daoguang Emperor had had enough. Opium imports had reached around 40,000 chests over 2,100 tons a year. Silver was being drained out of the Chinese economy, and in fact, the emperor's own son had died of an opium overdose. So he appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner to end the epidemic. Lin arrived in Canton in March of 1839 and moved immediately. He arrested Chinese dealers, he blockaded the foreign factories, and he demanded that every foreign merchant surrender their stocks and sign a pledge, at risk of death, never to traffic opium again. He understood that while the factory was outside of China, he could do what he could to make sure that opium was not consumed in China. So between June 3rd and June 25th in 1839, on the banks of the Pearl River, Lin Zexu personally oversaw the destruction of seized opium. The process lasted 23 days, and it involved the destruction of more than 1,000 tons of illegal opium. In fact, people said that you could smell the burning opium. You could smell its destruction from miles away. William Jardine had left Canton before the confiscation. Not to retreat, but to re-strategize. He wasn't going to give up the opium network that easily. Once he got back to London, Jardine's first order of business was to meet with the new Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston. Together, they created a comprehensive war plan, known to historians as the Jardine Paper. A private drug merchant had just designed a military campaign for the British Empire. So Palmerston sent the fleet, and the first of the infamous Opium Wars took place between England and China from 1839 to 1842. And to be honest, the war was really short and one-sided. British ships and artillery outdid the Chinese in basically every way. In Parliament, William Gladstone rose to condemn it, saying a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated to cover this country with permanent disgrace, I do not know, and I have not read of. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in August of 1842, demanded 21 million silver dollars from the Chinese. 6 million specifically for the opium Lin Zexu had destroyed. After, 5 Chinese ports were forced open. Hong Kong ceded to Britain in perpetuity. The treaty didn't legalize opium, of course. It just facilitated England's reappearance, along with its trade network. And 17 years later, Britain was back in full force. So, of course, a second Opium War began with a pretext that was so thin that even Palmerston's own parliament voted against it. A Chinese-owned ship named the Arrow, registered in Hong Kong, had its flag allegedly lowered by Chinese officials in 1856. Britain and France saw this as insurmountable disrespect. They used it as a justification for a second military campaign. In October of 1860, forces burned down the old summer palace in Yuan, 350 acres, representing 2 centuries of Qing imperial culture. The English were going to make it well known that they wanted to sell opium to the Chinese population, and they were going to do it at any cost. The Convention of Peking that followed finally legalized opium in China. It forced open 11 more ports. It ceded Kowloon. The Qing dynasty signed in humiliation what historians now call the beginning of China's century of humiliation, a phrase that is still used in Beijing today. It's still sharp. It's still political. And even after the Second Opium War, opium imports rose continuously to as much as 80,000 chests, 4,320 tons per year. Estimates of the number of addicts in China by the 1880s ran as high as 40 million people. The Qing economy collapsed. Opium exports to China eventually accounted for 1/7 of British India's entire revenue. The greatest empire on earth, on which the sun never set, the British Empire, was funding itself with a drug it had decided was too dangerous to sell at home, but which it very profitably sold to the Chinese. And the trade wouldn't end until more than 30 years later, in 1913. 60 years after the guns, when domestic moral pressure in Britain, driven by Quaker activists and the alarmed anti-opium society, finally closed the Patna factory and wound down the Bengal monopoly. The thing is, it didn't really do much because by then, China was completely broken. The Qing dynasty had collapsed the year before, and the British Empire was withering by this time. However, there was a new empire who had noticed exactly what the Brits had done, and they learned that lesson, that if you wanted to control the distribution of opium, and if you wanted to have a stronghold and a presence in the opium corridor, you had to have presence in Eastern Asia.